This is Rick Levine with your May 2020 astrology forecast. And I am once again recording this in my home studio rather than live at Soul Food Coffee House, because obviously we are all doing the social distancing, quarantine, shelter at home, whatever you want to call it, due to this crazy situation that humanity has found itself in, um, and we will address all of that in just a moment. May is quite an interesting month for a number of reasons. How could it not be an interesting month based upon what's going on? Of course. Um, but before I get into that, I would like to just update you on a couple of things. Obviously, my schedule has changed due to events being postponed or canceled or turned into online events. And I just want to update you on some of these because some of these are exciting because you might not have been able to attend prior, but because now you don't have to travel somewhere, you might be able to attend some of these things. So the first thing I want to mention, which is May 4th through the 10th, was going to be a week-long conference in Costa Rica on the beach, but now it'll be in your living room, my living room, and everyone else's living room or study. And this is being sponsored by Kaipacha and New Paradigm Astrology. And there will be 9 speakers at this event from May 4th to the 10th. Sol Janassin, Julia Simas, Timothy Halloran, Nadia Shaw, Maurice Fernandez, Ari Moshe Wolf, Christina Caudill, and of course Kaipacha, and me. This conference online, this virtual event, will include online dinners and even some yoga practices, some experiential stuff. It should be a lot of fun, and you can find the link right there. The second event I want to talk about is NORWAC. That's the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is usually held here in Seattle, Washington. But now you do not have to get on an airplane to go to it. It will also be a virtual event on Memorial Day weekend, actually May 21st through the 25th. And you can go to NORWAC, that's NORWAC.net, and you can find out more information about that, including the amazing speakers, classes. And again, when you go to NORWAC, usually you can only attend one class, and there's typically about a half a dozen classes going on simultaneously. Now, by attending, you get all the tapes to all the lectures, and it's going to be also an amazing event. The next event is going to be a weekend that I was going to be teaching myself up in Toronto, Canada, for the Astrology Toronto group. And this will be on June 5th through the 7th. And this will be a Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday event. And you can get information on that at astrologytoronto.com. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Bali. That's far enough in the future that I'm holding out that this is going to fly, and so are we. This is in Bali, Indonesia, December 5th through the 15th. It's an initiation into astrology, and we'll have more about this as the months unfold. But I just want to mention that if you feel like you can't travel now and there's someplace you wanted to go, you may want to resolve that by scheduling Bali for December. One last thing before we jump into the month of May, and that is a reminder that many of you know I've been writing daily horoscopes for nearly 20 years. And in those daily horoscopes for all the signs, I've written these little overviews. Well, I don't write the daily signs anymore, but I've extended or expanded the overviews, and you can now find my daily overviews, which is kind of like a report on the cosmic weather of the day. Doesn't matter what your sign is. If it rains, you know, some of us might like the rain, some of us might want sunshine. We react differently to the weather, but the weather is the weather. And so these planet pulses, these daily planet pulses, are available on my Instagram account, and that's Rick Levine Astrologer. Rick Levine Astrologer, and sign up for that for free, and you can get my daily planet pulses on Instagram. All right, so May 2020. It's been a crazy year. It's been a year that every astrologer that I know that has been predicting major events and major changes for 2020 that began, or that we predicted would begin in January with the Saturn Pluto conjunction, and would take us right up through the end of the year when we have Jupiter forming its conjunction with Saturn, but in the next sign, in Aquarius rather than Capricorn. And this year is unfolding right according to that schedule, and yet in a way that none of us could have imagined. Now, we all had different scenarios for how it might have unfolded, but what we're seeing is something that obviously was to some extent unpredictable, even though we might have thought that there could be an epidemic or pandemics or something of that sort. No one quite saw this unfolding in this way exactly. And it's that really that we need to address for the coming month. The main events for May are one, that Venus, which has been slowing down, turns retrograde in May, and Venus actually turns retrograde on May 12th. And we'll get to the Venus story in depth, because it plays such a strong background issue, not only for the month of May, but for the entire summer. But the fact that Venus moved into Gemini back in April, and it doesn't move out of Gemini until the end of August, until the beginning of August. And so that's April, May, June, July, August. That's almost 4 months. April, May, June, July. That's 4 months in Gemini, and that in itself is a very important statement. We'll get to that, back to that in just a moment. But Venus turning retrograde on May 12th is really just part of the retrograde story, because we actually have Pluto having just turned retrograde back on April 25th. And then we have Saturn turning retrograde on May 10th, and Jupiter turning retrograde on May 14th. So what we're going to have by the time we get to mid-May, we're going to have Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus doesn't turn retrograde until August, and Pluto. And actually Neptune turns retrograde in June. So in May, we're getting the first backwash of planets that are setting up this period of time that is going to take us not only from May, but into June, July, and then even into August. And then later on this year, we then have Mars turning retrograde in September, and it stays retrograde all through September and October, and doesn't turn direct until mid-November. Now, many of you who have followed my teachings know that I do not believe that retrograde planets are bad, but they are an intensification of the energy, because planets turn retrograde when they get closer to Earth. And as such, when the energy gets louder, sometimes we actually shut it down. It's the same phenomenon of pharmaceutically treating a hyperactive child, not that I'm approving of this, but treating a hyperactive child with an amphetamine derivative that actually creates a higher level of energy in the thought processes that then shut it down. And so in a way, we are at a time where the where the higher number of planets and outer heavyweight planets turning retrograde, in a way, is an intensification of the energy. And it also, because retrograde planets appear to move backwards, it often means that we're recovering old territory that we've already covered, whether it's a Mercury retrograde or a Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. They all have that same thing of, in the sky, they look like they're going ahead, then they look like they move backward, then they look like they're going ahead, and they're still always moving the same. It's an optical illusion based upon the relative motion and proximity of the planets to Earth. But the important thing to understand here is that, as much as I would like to say, hey, this whole craziness of this pandemic, epidemic, as I've been calling it, a dual pandemic, there's a viral component, but the real epidemic is an epidemic of fear, of invasion, of our boundaries by something external, in this, which is a Saturn-Pluto issue every time Saturn and Pluto join up. But it often is a physiological break or breakthrough in the system, as we are experiencing now. But it's also obviously the epidemic or pandemic of fear and uncertainty and what the hell is going on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this tonight. Listening to last month's April's forecast, or the April mid-month forecast, I spend a lot of time talking about how no one really knows what's going on. And that will be a theme a little later in the talk this evening, because no one knows what's going on still. And it's not going to clear up anytime soon, although we may get glimpses of awareness through this. The other thing that's significant in May is the fact that the nodes, which spend about a year and a half in a sign, change sign. Now, here we have to have a very short conversation, and I don't want to go too technical on this, but there are two ways to track the node. Now, remember, the nodes of the moon, the nodes of any planet, the nodes of any vibrations are places where the vibrations intersect. So if you throw a rock into a pond and the ripples spread outward, and then you throw another rock in the pond and those ripples spread outward, where the ripples cross, they make points. And even though the energy coming out from the two rocks thrown in, even though that energy moves away from the centers concentrically, away from the centers, where they cross, they make points. And those points are called nodes or knots. And those points generate standing waves or waves of their own called interference patterns. So the nodes of the moon are really where the wave of the moon going around the Earth intersects with the wave of the Earth going around the sun. Now, the problem with measuring the nodes of the moon, which there's nothing there physically, but energetically, it's a PowerPoint, because it holds its position. Even though the moon is changing its orbit, the fact of the matter is those nodes hold a position for a much longer period of time. Again, about a year and a half in each sign. Two things to know about the moon's nodes. One is that all the planets move clockwise, and the nodes of the moon are backwards. The nodes of the moon move retrograde. And if you think about it, it's the same thing as a top. If you spin a top and the top is spinning around clockwise, as the top begins to slow down, it begins to wobble, but the wobble is backwards to the direction that it spins. So the nodes of the moon, basically roughly an 18, 19-year cycle, the nodes of the moon move backwards in that period of time, one complete cycle through the zodiac. However, the nodes of the moon themselves wobble forward, backward, sometimes in the course of days, not like planets that turn retrograde once, or in Mercury's case, 3 times a year for an extended period of time. The moon, the moon's nodes, which normally travel retrograde, actually go direct for a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 days at a time, and then they don't go retrograde again, which is their normal direction, for a few days to a week, and then they go backward, and then they go forward, and they go retrograde and direct and retrograde and direct. Now, we have two ways of mapping the trajectory, the retrograde trajectory of the nodes of the moon. One of them is by following accurately where it is minute by minute, day by day, knowing that it's actually going like this, wobbling back and forth and back and forth. The other is, because the wobble is so fast, we can take its average trajectory and we can calculate a smoother path that doesn't account for these little vacillations, if you will, in its path. These two ways of calculating the moon's nodes are called the true node, which maps exactly where it is, even though it's moving back and forth very rapidly, or the mean node, which is not like mean, it's the average node, or it's actually the mathematical mean of how that path, how that trajectory actually moves. Now, there are a lot of astrologers who are, in fact, telling us and reminding us that we have the moon's nodes moving into from Capricorn Cancer, where they've been, moving back into Gemini, or Sagittarius and Gemini, where they will be for the next year and a half. And there are those of us, or there are those astrologers who are suggesting that this happens on May 4th. And in fact, the June 4th date is actually the date that the true node, the actual node, backs into, changes signs and moves back into the sign of Sagittarius and of Sagittarius and of Gemini. However, the mean node, in other words, the average path of the node, doesn't move back into Sagittarius and Gemini until June 4th, a full month later. So I don't care which nodes you use in your individual calculations. As far as I'm concerned, the jury is out. There's a part of me that thinks the more accurate something is, the true node is available. Why shouldn't we use it? On the other hand, sometimes we have more data than actually it gives us a false sense of accuracy. Regardless, whether you're looking at the early May or early June, we are now at a transition point where for a year and a half, the north node of the moon, actually the nodes of the moon themselves have been in Cancer and Capricorn, and in fact, the north node of the moon, having been in Cancer for the last year and a half, has in some ways heightened our sense of insecurity and our need for protecting our homelands, if you will. And the south node in Capricorn, that has also been part of the Saturn transit of Capricorn and Jupiter transit of Capricorn, and even Pluto, because over the last year and a half, the south node has moved across all of those planets in Capricorn. And this in some ways has reminded us that the structures, Capricorn, that we thought were so fundamental actually are not as stable as we thought. Now, as the nodes move backward from the Cancer Capricorn axis, both of which deal with security. Cancer deals with security by creating a hard outer shell and protecting our emotions, by giving us a place to hide or a place to feel secure, whether it's our home or family or nation state. We feel secure when we're behind the walls. Capricorn, on the other hand, develops security by mastering of the external world, but they're both still having to do with creating a fundamental sense of security. Now, as the nodes move backward into the north node into Gemini, south node into Sagittarius, we're going to see a subtle shift in energy, because remember, there's no planet there, but it's an energetic point that creates the vibrations that everything else resonates to. It's the nodes of the moon might be called metaphysical, because they really do connect with the soul and the purpose of things that are not necessarily what we see in the outer world. In fact, in Vedic astrology, the nodes are associated with the Sanskrit term Maya. Maya meaning the veil of illusion that prevents us from seeing the true nature of reality. Anyhow, as the nodes shift back into Gemini and Sagittarius, the background energy is going to move into communication, because obviously with the North Node in Gemini, we have an emphasis on sending and receiving information. This Gemini energy is important. The key or ruling planet of Gemini is Mercury. We now have Venus turning retrograde in Gemini. Again, Mercury. Mercury, Venus are doing a bit of a dance now. We have Mercury in Venus's sign, Taurus, and we have Venus in Mercury's sign, Gemini. And these two planets they're each dispositing or doing the work of the other planet. And the astrological term for this is mutual reception. These planets are each receiving each other's energies. It's almost like Mercury and Taurus is saying, hey, Venus, I got you covered. And Venus in Gemini is saying, hey, Mercury, what do you want me to do? And so this Venus and Mercury dance is very significant. And the fact that the nodes are moving back into Gemini during this period of time, the North Node, again, shifts the underpinning of everything that's going on from a sense of security to a sense of flow of information. Whether that flow is happening smoothly and honestly, or whether it's being blocked, these will become this will become the important focal point. The North Node being in Gemini, the idea that we need more information, and we need information that we can connect to all the other pieces to get the big picture. But the South Node in Sagittarius is basically the habit that we have of going to what we believe, to going to our opinions. And rather than taking information as it is, we take information and we might actually take that information and try to fit it onto what we already know. So these are the two big things that are going on, and they both have strong implications that we will unfold as we look at the charts. Okay, so here we are looking at a chart for May 1st, 2020, and this chart is for noon in Redmond, Washington. These charts are all Aries rising charts, which means that wherever you are in the world, the planetary positions with respect to the signs of the zodiac and their aspects are exact for the times that are Pacific Daylight Time, but there's no horizon or use of houses in this, because you are all in different places around the world. And so it's kind of superfluous to create a quadrant house system here and use houses at all. The fact of the matter is that wherever you are on the planet, the sun at noon on May 1st is at 11 degrees of Taurus and 51 minutes. The fact of the matter is that Venus is at 19 degrees 27 minutes wherever you are on the planet at 12 noon Pacific Daylight Time. So you need to convert that into Eastern Time or Greenwich Mean Time or wherever you are on the planet. So starting out, the important thing here to understand, one other thing is, in the way that I have charts drawn up, the closer the aspects are, the fatter the lines. And so here we can see that Venus is squaring Neptune, and that line is fairly fat. And of course, that aspect is very, very close. It is exact on May 3rd, but it will be exact again because of its retrograde motion. It will be squaring Neptune again on May 20th, but we'll get to that also in just a moment. The fact of the matter is, though, that Mercury or Uranus is square to Saturn, but that line is a very faint line because it's 5 degrees orb. And so the lines are, don't let that mislead you. It's that way we can just read what's going on really quickly. One other thing is because we're taking a macro look at the month of Head, I don't have the aspects to the moon drawn in. Obviously here, the moon at 23 degrees of Leo, midday on May 1st, the moon is opposite Mars at 22 degrees of Aquarius, but there are no aspect lines drawn into the moon. So where we want to start off in order to get a good sense of what May is about is because of the fact that Venus does turn retrograde. And I said we would drill down on this a little bit later. Well, we're now here. Venus actually moved into Gemini back the beginning of April. And Venus turns retrograde, excuse me, on May 12th. Venus turns retrograde on May 12th at 21 degrees of Gemini. And you can see right now here on the 1st of May, Venus is already at almost 19 and a half degrees of Gemini, which means that Venus is barely moving against the backdrop of stars right now. Venus only moves 19, 20, 21, and it moves less than 3 degrees over the course of the next almost 2 weeks. So let's move the chart backwards to the end of March, when Venus is at the end of Taurus, and on April 3rd, Venus moves into Gemini, and Venus begins its 4-month stay in Gemini. Now, as we move this ahead, we want to note when Venus reaches, oh, there it is right there, that 5 degree, 20 minutes, 5 degrees, right around there on April 9th, Venus reached the point in the sky where she will retrograde to, and we'll see this in just a moment, because once Venus reached that 5 degree point back on April 9th, from then on, Venus is moving in areas of Gemini, which she will traverse 3 times. So let's make a little mental note here of Venus being at almost at 5 degrees of Gemini. And let's continue to move this ahead. And we'll take Venus all the way through toward, toward May 12th. Here we are now at the beginning of May. Venus is at 19 and a half degrees. And now we have Venus on May 12th. And Venus is barely moving now. She's 21 degrees, 40 minutes. On May 10th, May 11th, she's at 21:49. She's at 21:50, 21 degrees, 50 minutes on the 12th. That's when she turns retrograde. She pretty much stays right around that degree, but then she begins to pick up speed moving backwards. And as she turns retrograde and begins to gain speed, she will move all the way back. We're already in June now. She'll move all the way back to right there to that 5 degree point on the 24th of June, where she then turns direct. So in other words, when Venus reached that 5 degree point back in April, all that area is area that she will cover 3 times, once going forward, now going backward, and then at the end of June, when Venus turns direct, she'll go through that exact same area again, a 3rd and final time. And in fact, the point at which she turns retrograde was 21 degrees, 50 minutes. And when she reaches that 21 degree, 50 minute point in late July, actually, it's really just the beginning of August, right around the end of last days of July, that's when she will leave her shadow, the area that she will travel direct, retrograde, and direct through. And so in a way, between early April, let's say April 9th, 10th, and the end of July, we're stuck in this Venus period of time where Venus takes on a heavier weight because she's holding this position again and again and again and again. Now, before we bring in all the other planets, let's come back to now. I say now, I mean May 1st. So here we have a chart for May 1st, but I've now added back in the Sun at 11 degrees, 51 minutes Taurus, Mercury at 8 degrees, 13 minutes of Taurus, and I've added in Neptune for a very important reason, because we open this month up with Venus forming a square to Neptune that I mentioned earlier, and that square is exact on May 3rd. But because of Venus's retrograde, what happens is that Venus, now I want you to watch again, just the Venus-Neptune here. And as we see Venus squaring Neptune at the beginning of the month, I'm just going to move this ahead, and we can see how Mercury catches up not only with the sun, but then it catches up with Venus, and it catches up with Venus around May 20th, which is also May 20th is a very significant period of time. Right in there, we have the new moon on May 22nd, and we have the sun moving from Taurus into Gemini on the 19th. On the 20th, it actually, the sun moves into Gemini early in the morning on the 20th. But we have retrograde Venus backing into that square with Neptune again, with Mercury catching up to Venus. So we have that Venus Mercury together squaring Neptune. And the reason why this is significant, you'll remember that back in March, when Mercury was retrograding forever in Pisces, it was retrograding around Neptune and its conjunction with Neptune in Pisces, which was this whole beginning of this deception. Well, it wasn't the beginning of a deception, but it was an intensification of not knowing the truth, not knowing what was going on. And now as Venus squares Neptune at the beginning of the month, retrograde squares it again around May 20th. And in fact, when we move this on into the future, we will see that it takes a while to get there, but that Venus will turn direct eventually. And there's Venus turning direct. And now we're in July, and right around there, we can see now Venus toward the end of July. As Venus is getting ready to come out of its shadow, again, it will make that third and final square to Neptune. So this is why the Venus's extended stay in Gemini is so significant, because we not only don't we know what's going on, we're almost enamored with the illusions, with the fantasies, because when Venus squares Neptune, we don't have clarity. We make it up. Fantasy doesn't fit in with reality. We will see in a little bit how there are other things that are bringing glimpses of reality. But I think through this whole period of time, we have to keep our guard up to make sure that we don't fall into traps of just believing what seems to be true out there. Because what seems to be true out there with Venus and Gemini, there's lots of truths, and the truths are all intersecting. They're all entangling. None of them are correct. All of them may have little glimpses of the truth tied into them, but it'll be very difficult to see things for the absolute truth during this period of time. All right, so here we are back on May 1st. And again, now we have a little bit of perspective about this Venus squaring Neptune. But I also just want to remind us that during this time, Venus is also still trining Mars, although she's slowing down and eventually will turn retrograde before she quite reaches that exact trine to Mars. But you can see here that Venus is trine to Mars Venus at 19, Mars at almost 22. So it's within about 2.5, 3 degrees of orb. And that certainly has been taking some of the pressure off of things, but that will begin to, as Venus turns retrograde, that aspect will begin to fade. We do have on May, so here we are on May 3rd, we have the exact Venus squaring Neptune. And again, the illusions and the fantasies, and also the creative urges here are very strong. I mean, this is not a negative aspect. It's just one that can present danger if we think that we're navigating by what we see. What we see is actually a little bit off kilter, or it's a little bit more based upon our subjective wishes and hopes and dreams and fantasies rather than what's out there. But also on May 4th, the following day, Mercury actually catches up with the sun. Now, Mercury is moving incredibly fast right now. Mercury actually it only spends about 2.5 weeks in Gemini once it gets there. Right now, it's moving through Taurus, and it catches up with the sun on May 4th. And so, for the day or two around this, what that means is that this is a bit of clarity, or it's a bit of certainty about our perceptions, but it's in Taurus. We have to be careful, because we might think that what we see and what we perceive is absolute truth. But remember, Mercury and Venus here are doing this little dance, even though there's no apparent aspect, because although Mercury and Taurus is down to basics and fundamental reality, and it's determined to say what it means and to mean what it says, that Mercury lining up with the sun even gives us more of a direct lineup of the sun's will with Mercury intellect in this. So there's something very direct and forceful here. But we look at this is taking place in the sign of Taurus. And so we look at Venus, because Venus is the planet that does Taurus's work, if you will. And Venus off in Gemini is squaring Neptune. And so there's still this lack of clarity that is not quite going away. The other piece here that is very significant is that Mercury and the sun in Taurus will actually move to create a sextile with Neptune over the days ahead. Remember, Mercury is moving faster than the sun right now. The sun moves about 1 degree a day. Mercury moves almost 2 degrees a day right now. So if we move this forward, we will watch Mercury first pass the sun, and then it forms the sextile with Neptune exactly. And so now Mercury and Neptune are kind of doing this dance where, again, we can be incredibly creative. Watch how people spin things. I know people are spinning things in every which way right now, but as that Mercury sextiles Neptune, we can either tell a good story or fall victim to a good story. Either way, it's also incredibly creative. This is very musical. It's very poetic. And so there is a higher spiritual vibe to this if we understand the fact that truth and illusion are not necessarily the same thing. Now, the other thing that happens that's of great significance on May 7th is the fact that we have a full moon. The Scorpio full moon occurs at 3:45 a.m. And again, that's Pacific Daylight Time. So that's 6:45 a.m. New York time. And that full moon in Scorpio, the Scorpio full moon at 17 degrees 20 minutes of Scorpio, is opposite the Taurus sun, obviously also at 17 degrees 20 minutes. But the significant thing here is that they are both coming into a trine and a sextile with Neptune. For those of you who have followed my teachings, you know that there is a point. There's 4 points. Every time there's an opposition, there are 4 points that form a trine to one side of the opposition and a sextile to the other. These points are named after a Greek philosopher mathematician named Thales. And the point of Thales here is actually 17 degrees, 20 minutes of Pisces. That would be the point at which is exactly trine the full moon and exactly sextile the sun at the moment of the full moon. However, we can notice that the moon will be trining Neptune just maybe 6 hours, 6 hours after the moon is full, and the sun will reach that sextile point roughly 3 days from now, and Mercury is actually already there. Mercury, which aligned with the sun just a few days ago, a couple days ago, is now actually forming that exact sextile to Neptune. And so we have here this very powerful full moon in Scorpio, sometimes called the Buddha full moon, because it's the full moon under which Buddha allegedly was born, was enlightened, and died. And it is a very powerful moon because the power of the sun in Taurus, even though Taurus is a yin, is a Venus, is a feminine energy sign, it happens in spring where the energy is masculine throughout the whole, it's yang, it's building, it's bolero, the energy is building. And Taurus is most Taurus right at mid-Taurus, at about 15 degrees of Taurus. And so we have this very powerful full moon that takes the simplicity and the determination and the practicalness, the practicality, the groundedness, the sensible and sensuality of Taurus, and it juxtaposes it with the complexity and the not earthiness, not practical, but the metaphysicalness of complex emotional entanglement of that Scorpio full moon. And so what happens here is that Neptune becomes the point at which the energy from this stress and from this tension is released. And again, the danger is buying into the illusion. However, the positive side of this is that imagination is the key to how we create our future. And this is a moment when we can use the power of dreams, the power of hope, the power of our imagination to actually create the scaffolding upon which we can build reality over the weeks and months ahead. So remember, this Neptune point is incredibly important for this full moon, because Neptune is forming the release point, the point of Thales, that is trine the full moon and sextile the sun and Mercury, the sun-Mercury conjunction still, but that Neptune is also being squared by Venus still. And so this becomes a very significant piece. By the way, if we're tracking the true node, you can see here that the nodes now have moved back. The north node has moved from, let's get it back. There we go. We go back a few days. Oh, and there's the, back on the 4th, we can see here the north node being in Cancer, and there the north node is in Gemini. And of course we have Venus approaching that north node, but it doesn't get there because Venus turns retrograde also. So this is a very powerful and very significant full moon because of what it does. Now, there's another piece to this full moon that I want to mention, and it's a very important piece because it involves a piece that we don't normally look at. Okay, we're still looking at the identical chart for the moment of the full moon, but I've taken out all the traditional aspects and I've drawn in this kind of yellowish mustard colored, these are the quintiles. These are based upon 1/5 and 2/5 of a circle. And again, for those of you who know my work, you know the importance that I put on quintiles, especially because quintiles create the five-pointed star and the Venus star, the Venus being the golden mean or the divine proportion to Earth. Venus as the planet of beauty hums in this quintile aspect. And what we see at this full moon is something that's incredibly powerful, something that's incredibly magical, and something that's very, very rare. And that is that we have the moon at 17 Scorpio, forming a 1/5 of a cycle. The quintile aspect. The moon is quintile to the Jupiter Saturn. In fact, if you take that midpoint of Jupiter and Saturn, it comes out to be roughly 29 and a half degrees of Capricorn, and that moon is very tightly quintile to that midpoint of Jupiter and Saturn. They are in turn quintile Chiron, which is in turn quintile to Venus, which is also forming a biquintile back to Jupiter, Saturn. So what we have here is the full moon is 1 point on a 5-pointed star. The moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Venus turn out to be 4 of 5 points on a 5-pointed star. And this is magical. This is magical because although quintiles can be difficult, they're also incredibly creative. These are points at which we can manifest something which has never been manifest before. It's not playing a piece on the piano that has been written and scored and that you're practicing and practicing it and playing it incredibly beautiful. No, this is making something up. It's improvisation, but it's the improvisation that artists and poets and writers do when they're creating something new. And in a way, this strong quintile lean on this full moon is incredibly powerful, especially because it involves Venus. And remember that Venus is ready to turn retrograde here, especially because we have the sun in this chart and the Sun-Mercury conjunction and Uranus too in Venus's sign Taurus. And also we have here that Venus is actually one of these 4 points on the 5-pointed star, but Venus is actually connecting up with Jupiter in particular, but Jupiter and Saturn, but Jupiter in particular, and Chiron, the wounded healer, the mentor, the teacher planet in Aries, where it's creating new ground also is part of this picture. Now, there is additionally a magical quintile that is building between Mars and Uranus, but I really just want to stay focused on this quintile pattern that involves the full moon because this is extraordinary. I've never seen anything quite like this. And quintiles, though, sometimes pass without even noticing them. In a natal chart, they are always profound. But in transits, it's like grabbing the golden ring. We have to make the reach. We have to actually do something with the energy to turn it into something important. So as we move this chart ahead, by May 9th, we have another thing that comes into being that is also an important part, at least of the first half of May. And that is that Mercury, moving now ahead of the sun, Mercury is going to be making trines to Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn. And it makes its first trine to these planets to Pluto on May 9th. It makes a trine to Jupiter the following day on May 10th. And then it makes its trine to Saturn on May 12th. Now, what happens in the interim is that Mercury moves into Gemini on the 11th. And as it moves into Gemini, it begins to pick up on that trine to Saturn at 1 degree, almost 2 degrees of Aquarius. And Saturn is getting ready for its turn retrograde because Saturn actually turns retrograde on the 10th. It's actually stationary here, barely moving at all. So we have Mercury making a trine to a stationary retrograde Saturn, which really stabilizes all of this energy. At the same time, through the 12th, the moon comes whizzing through Capricorn, highlighting again the Pluto, Jupiter, and then the Saturn. And I see that this period of time from the new moon all the way through the moon's movement into Aquarius, which occurs later on the 12th. This is a really very, very significant time, and a time where I think we can gain some clarity, not only about what's going on out there, but also about what's going on in here, what's going on in our relationships in general. Now, the fact that Mercury has moved into Gemini is also interesting because now Mercury is in the same sign as Venus, which is getting ready to go retrograde. Actually, it turns retrograde on the 12th, but it's really stationed for a couple of days. It barely moves at all. But what's interesting is that when Mercury moves into Gemini, the focus shifts because Mercury is at home in Gemini, and it's no longer receiving Venus's energies. Well, actually, it's still receiving Venus's energy, but it stops in Gemini because when it was in Taurus, it was sending it back to Venus. So while Mercury was in Taurus, there was this mutual reception dance going on between Mercury and Venus. But now when Mercury moves into Gemini, Mercury is basically more in its home element, and yet it makes that trine to Saturn, which really grounds it out. We might feel a sense of relief, like maybe we begin to see what's really happening here, although I would suggest it's not going to last. The other thing that occurs on the 12th is that we can see here that Mars is at the last degree of Aquarius. It's at 29 degrees of Aquarius. Now notice that Mars has continued to widen its distance of from the trine to Venus as Venus has slowed down now to get ready to turn, or actually has turned retrograde here. That Mars is just ready to move into Pisces if we move this ahead by May 13th. Actually, it's late on the 12th, that evening, that night, that Mars moves into Pisces. And Mars in Pisces is an interesting dance because Mars in Pisces is about directionality without a compass. Mars doesn't quite know where it's going when it's in Pisces, which can be really good if we're on a spiritual retreat, or if we're improvising music, or if we're following a state of creativity of any sort, where I think of Tolkien's line, all who wander are not lost. That's a perfect Mars in Pisces line. I think Mars in Pisces is all dressed up, but doesn't know where it's going. You know, it knows there's a party, but it can't find the invitation, and it doesn't know where the party's at. Now, Mars in Pisces can also be tremendously powerful because Mars is the warrior, and in Pisces, Mars becomes the spiritual warrior. And so here the game shifts a little bit as we actually get a sense of taking on the external world, taking on our own demons, our own fears, rather than with more information and more conceptualization as we might have when Mars was in Aquarius. Now, Mercury is in Gemini. There's still an intellectual thinking lean, but with Mars in Pisces, we may not be ready to push back in the same way. Instead, we're going more to a place that has something to do with our intuition, with our dreams, if you will. Incidentally, Mars actually moved into Aquarius the end of March, but Mars was in Aquarius for all of April and for a couple of weeks of May. It whizzes through Pisces in about 6 weeks. It moves into Pisces on May 12th, we're looking at right now, 12th, 13th. And it enters Aries on June 27th. But the interesting thing is that Mars turns retrograde while it's in Aries, and Mars spends the rest of the year in Aries. Mars stays in Aries for all of July, August, September, October, November, and December, and even most of January. And so we have Mars in Pisces, where we can dissolve and disintegrate our aggressions and our assertions and our motivations, and we can kind of use this as a recharging period for when Mars enters Aries, and whoosh, away we go. But then the retrograde, we pull back and release it again. And I imagine that this whole period of time of Mars in Aries for the second half of the year will bring its own stories with it. But right now, on the 12th, on the 13th, excuse me, we have Mars moving into Pisces. On the 14th, we have Jupiter turning retrograde. So now we've had Pluto turning retrograde at the end of April. We've had Saturn turn retrograde. We've had Venus turn retrograde. And now Jupiter turns retrograde. And Jupiter turns retrograde on the 14th at 27 degrees of Capricorn. And this is very important because Jupiter will retrograde back over Pluto. And then it will go direct over Pluto a third and final time toward the end of the year. We'll untangle that a little bit later, but we still have this whole thing of Jupiter, the magnifying lens, Pluto, the deconstruction. Viruses are related to Pluto because they're between death and rebirth. They're neither dead nor alive. They're actually technically not living. But they're a bridge between the inorganic and the organic, if you will. But Jupiter moving back towards Pluto may again be another indication that this whole thing is not quite over yet. So we've had Mercury, as it moved through the latter degrees of Taurus and into the beginning of Gemini, Mercury formed trines, harmonious trines, with Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn. And now behind that, starting around the 14th, the sun on a slower trajectory will make those same trines, again, stabilizing energy, giving us a sense of practicality with the sun in Taurus. But that sun trining Pluto, there's a deeper wave coming up now that's giving us somewhere to go. There's something here that is surfacing that we can contend with, we can work with if it's out in the open. And in fact, over the days ahead, by the time we get to the 17th, the sun actually then reaches at 27 degrees. It forms a trine with Jupiter. And again, we have some optimism, but also maybe some more growth, some things happening that are, again, magnifying, but also hopeful. And then the sun moves into Gemini. We're still watching the sun down here. The sun moves into Gemini right there on the 20th. There's the sun moving into Gemini. And once the sun moves into Gemini, it begins to pick up on a trine to Saturn that is exact on the 22nd. And here we have the new moon in Gemini. I'm going to run this back and come back to that again. But I wanted to show you the trajectory of the sun making all those same trines to the same planets, Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn, that Mercury did a week before. And again, this is the stabilizing side of the month, even though we're kind of churning over old things now that Venus is actually turning, or has already turned retrograde. The fact of the matter is that we also have some deeper kind of patterns emerging that might be able to get us through this next phase. So let's watch the moon now as we move ahead from the 15th, 16th. As we hit the 17th, the moon moves into Aries. It lines up with Chiron on the 17th. By the 18th, now what we're watching here is a combination of the moon coming toward a new moon and the sun at the end of Taurus. The moon doesn't catch up to the sun until it's in Gemini. And so in a way, we've already had the Taurus new moon. And so in a way, what we're doing is we're finalizing all this stability stuff. In fact, as the moon hits Taurus on the 20th, we want to have groundedness, we want to have stability, but the moon lines up with Uranus, and then we have the second of the three squares between Venus and Neptune. We talked about this earlier. And so what's really interesting to me here is that we have this little sense, a quick flavor of, oh my gosh, we have a place to stand, everything is stabilized, it's all going to be okay. And now it's, no, we're back to fantasy land again. And Venus forms that Venus forms the square with Neptune, while the sun moves into Gemini, picks up on the trine to Saturn, which again is stabilizing, but we're stabilizing in a new world. We're stabilizing with different information. We're stabilizing now that we know something that we didn't know before. We also have Mercury coming into conjunct Venus, which is coming up closely on the 22nd. And we also then have the new moon, and the new moon is at 10:38 a.m. on the 22nd. And this new moon is in Gemini, and this new moon is trining Saturn. And this new moon is, even though it's in an air sign, even though now Mercury is lined up with Venus, and there's a connection now between that whole intuitive, sensual, imagination, fantasy piece of Venus squaring Neptune. We now have Mercury in the mix, where Mercury is also squaring Neptune. And yet, and this is a total paradox, because the new moon is stabilizing, is trining to Saturn in Aquarius. We're at once getting this whole, oh my God, this isn't what I thought it was. There's the sense of unreality, and yet we're finally feeling like we might have some real information here. It ain't over yet. It isn't over, because it's not until Venus does its complete retrograde thing and then all these planets begin moving forward that the whole truth of what's going on is unfolding. But this new moon is incredibly important, because this is the moment which we can plant the seed for the intention for the following month. And this seed has Saturn's reality. It has the responsible, constructive, stabilizing element of Saturn, that if we plant the right seed and we nurture it, we can actually grow this. And the question is, what are we going to grow it into? Well, here we have the Mercury conjuncting retrograde Venus in Gemini, squaring Neptune, and our imaginations are free to make this up however we want. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever we dream will come true. But it does mean that if enough of us make a collective dream, and then we actually plant that seed of intention with the follow through, with the concreteness of Saturn, we actually can set the tone for what will come to fruition over time. Remember, Saturn is now retrograde, and Saturn is heading back for a remembrance of what it was like when it was in Capricorn. And so none of this is complete yet. None of this is complete yet. And none of this is complete yet. It also means that we are getting glimpses of what's ahead. And if we work the energy right, we can actually set the tone for what's to follow. Now, as the month, the latter part of the month unfolds, and we'll hit this up with the mid-month update in a greater detail, and because of the whole epidemic, pandemic, coronavirus thing, whatever that thing is, and I'm not making less of it, it's a major thing. The mid-month update, which again is usually just for my $3 a month patrons. I would encourage any of you and all of you to support at that level, but I'll make that mid-month available again for everyone. But just taking a quick scan over the last part of the month, the end of the month, what's significant is after the new moon, I mean, for the next day or so, next 2 days, we have all these planets in in Gemini. We have the sun, we have the moon, we have Venus and Mercury, and the North Node. We're really getting a flavor of what this mercurial energy is about. And over the course of the 23rd and into the 24th, the moon will actually join up with Venus and Mercury. And of course, that means it will also square Neptune. And so the energy of that new moon is continued for a couple of days until the moon itself enters Cancer. Now, the thing about the moon entering Cancer on the 24th, 25th, actually late on the 24th, is that it's also setting the tone for Mercury, which will come in right behind it. And on the 24th, before we get getting ahead of myself, on the 24th, we also have Mars in Pisces forming a sextile with Uranus. Now, this is a day where the energy can express, and the energy expression here, though, is more intuitive, it's instinctual, it's spiritual, it's not necessarily directly responsive to what we're thinking or what we're feeling. Remember, Mars has been squared to first Mercury, and now the sun will still come through that square to Mars over the days ahead. I don't think we reach that. Yeah, we don't reach that until June. But right here on the 24th and 25th, we're getting this expression again where things can be expressed with greater ease and facility, meaning that those things where the tension, places where the tension is built, the tension can come out right now, and it may not be quite as destructive as it could be at other times. However, as we move this forward, we're now watching that Mercury, and we're watching Mercury coming up to the last degree of Gemini right there. And on the 28th, Mercury moves from Gemini. It whizzed through Gemini way too fast. It was at home there, but it was only for a couple of weeks. And now Mercury, by the time we get to the end of the month, Mercury is on into Cancer, giving us another layer of this emotional component, this insecurity, security issue. And over the weeks ahead, we will have Mercury opposing the planets in latter degrees of Capricorn, and eventually following next month, the sun will do the same. But right now we have Mercury in Cancer, which is giving us a little bit of kind of replugging and pulling back in again. The intellect is not as eager to connect the dots. We just need a rest. And I think that that's really what this month is about. This month is about the weariness that sets in. It's first the shock and the, oh my God, is this really happening? And then it's, okay, this is what we need to deal with. And then we settle into the pattern of, okay, now we're dealing with it. But it begins to, as Venus turns retrograde and the outer planets are turning retrograde, there's just this sense of weariness. And when Mercury hits Cancer, I think there's a sense of mental weariness. We want to go back to some nostalgic place where we felt safe. Whether we can ever go there again, we just want to, we want to go back. We want to go into the past. We want to go into our childhood. We want to go home, even though we've been stuck in some ways at home for a while. There's something about the safety of having that protection that we get when we're in that sign of Cancer. Incidentally, Mercury also, as it moves from Gemini to Cancer, also crosses over the nodal axis. And I think, again, there's this intensification of communication. We have on the 29th, the sun making a sextile with Chiron. We have the potential here for learning something new, Chiron in Aries, teaching us something new. We have the ability to heal. Also, we have, if you notice, Chiron's at 8 degrees, Uranus is at 8 degrees, and the sun on the 29th is at 8 degrees. And although I don't have the semi-sextiles drawn in here, this is kind of like a semi-sextile run, if you will. In fact, if we add Mars to that, even though it's a couple degrees off, we would have Mars, Chiron, Uranus, and the sun each kind of playing with the sextiles, interrelated sextiles and squares and semi-sextiles. And I think that it's a buzz. There's a buzz here, but I think it's hard to act on it, although we have some real kind of breakthroughs, I think, not only in thinking, but also in the possibility of how we can heal ourselves or how we can heal others. On the last day of the month, although I don't have these aspects drawn in, as Mercury moves into Cancer, Mercury makes a quincunx with Saturn, and that quincunx is the irritation that we can't separate from the social system from which we seem to be isolated from. We can't fully separate from it. Mercury in Cancer is the home and family and the internalization and the reflection and the contemplation, and yet its quincunx to Saturn basically says, yes, but the social responsibilities still lay in the outer world, and how are we going to balance out the two of those? How are we going to make that work? So wrapping this whole thing together into trying to give it a sense of finality, if you will. The thing is that there are definite shifts this month. The nodal shift may be subtle at first, but it will build. Mercury's movement into Gemini is another shift that will build. Venus's retrograde and the role that Venus plays in its square that repeats not only at the beginning of the month and the end of the month, but again later on in the year, that Venus square to Neptune, the new moons and the full moon in Gemini being the seed for the future, but also this backwash that's building, the Pluto retrograde, the Saturn retrograde, then the Venus retrograde, then the Jupiter retrograde, and coming yet into the other retrogrades that will unfold later on this year. There's a sense that we're not moving into the future quite as fast as we might want to. Now, that can be frustrating on one level, but on another level, there's something else that the cosmos is making sure we get. And what we need to get is this transition that we're going through as humanity goes through this thing together, because with electronic digital communication, social media, we're not doing this isolated city by city, street corner by street corner, family by family. We're going through this as a global community. I think of Marshall McLuhan's book from the early 70s, War and Peace in the Global Village. This is the global village, and we're going through this together, and we've never been here before. And I think that with these retrogrades are really teaching us, what they're going to lean on us is that we can't just headstrong run into the future and say, okay, I got it, something's different now, let's go back to the way things were. We're going to have to incorporate this. We're going to have to move slowly. We're going to have to really readdress how we live our lives. We're going to have to readdress our relationship to our outer worlds, to our community, to each other, to our homes, to our jobs, to our family. And I think that it's not just a matter of getting back to normal. In a way, the new normal is, I think, the adjustments that we need to face and that we need to make over the months and maybe even years ahead. This is new territory that we are in. I don't think that we're going to have a real flavor as to how the bigger picture unfolds until we get through the retrograde Jupiter, Pluto, the direct over Jupiter, and then the movement of Saturn direct back into Aquarius, Jupiter into Aquarius, and the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in December. And it really won't be until 2021 when we're finally into someplace new and we can look back at 2020, and that 2020 will be a year that will go down in the history books. And I don't think we're done with it. We have other things yet to unfold. But I think that the lesson of May, Taurus is nothing happens quickly. Taurus is, this is where we are. We're going to stay here until we get it. And even as the sun moves into Gemini toward the end of the month, we still have Uranus hanging back in Taurus, and we have that looming Saturn from Aquarius that will make it square to Uranus over the next year, year and a half. And so this kind of dynamic between the old ways and the new ways, between Saturn, stability, structure, and keep things the way they are, hold on to the status quo, and Uranus, blow it all up, change everything, move into the future. But Uranus is in Taurus. Taurus says, no, don't make me change quickly. I will change slowly, surely, methodically. I will get there. An object at rest maybe tends to stay at rest, but an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and Taurus is momentum. And so the month of May becomes a month of building momentum, but the momentum may not be to get to the next place right away. The momentum may be, how do we incorporate the deeper issues that we are now all facing together as a global family and individually, and in our homes, in our communities, and in our relationship to our loved ones and our careers. So that's it. Again, feel free to support my work by going to Patreon. I appreciate that. That keeps me going and keeps the additional videos going. The more support I get, the more videos I can produce for you guys. Also, Instagram, Rick Levine Astrologer, for the daily updates. And more than ever, I feel like a repeating record. Think cosmically. Stretch your brain out to the edges of the universe. Think cosmically as far as we can think, but act locally. I'm Rick Levine.